We have been here since we've been married 37 years. We've been here at MDPC for probably 35 years. And I know many of your faces here, but I would just tell you the importance of finding an amazing community like we have here at MDPC is just imperative for our Christian life. You know, whether you are utilizing it to its max or not, I mean, it's up to you, but just know that there comes a time in all of our lives where you need good community. This church has been with us. We've had some amazing times. All 4 of our kiddos were baptized here. We've had some of the most difficult times in our life, and this church, Brett, and many others were here surrounding us, so I just can't say enough about what it's like to have just some deep roots, and I know many of you do. I see you. I've known you as long as I've been here, so I just encourage and hope all of you will continue doing that. So as Brett said, I've been doing counseling since mid-'80s, and one of the things that you discover in the field, my master's in clinical psychology, is, you know, there's not always a lot of real collaboration between you have to make it work when you are a Christ follower in the field of clinical psych, because there's at times there's just some disparity, and I've navigated enough now. I know what I'm doing with it, but there's not always a lot of good overlap. There is some, though, and one of those is what we're talking about this morning, and that is the Bible is really replete with speaking about issues around your thinking. What goes on in what goes on in your heart, what goes on in your mind, and the field of, so over here from a biblical perspective, and over here in the field of cognitive psychology. And there's nothing new under the sun. That field of cognitive psychology, you know, rose really back in the 60s, and borrowing a lot from what Solomon put in Proverbs, you know, thousands of years ago. So I'm going to take this perspective this morning from understanding sort of this overlap and understanding what I just looked through my own schedule on any given week, and I thought, what are some of the things that are important that would be helpful for any man to understand about anxiety? And so first, and I went back and listened to all the YouTubes, and there's some great messages here that were presented, Tom's and Mike Handel's and others. I mean, there's just some really good things that were presented here. Alf's the very first one. I'll reference that a little later. But anyway, I just want to encourage you to listen to those if you haven't. There's some really good things here. I want to start off with understanding, and a great understanding in the book of Philippians, been mentioned in this series already. Rejoice in the Lord always. I will say it again, rejoice. Let your gentleness be evident to all. The Lord is near. Do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition, let your requests be made known to God. With thanksgiving, present your request to God. And the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. I have that verse memorized from another version, so I had it written here, cut and paste. So anyway, cut me off guard there. But this idea, the peace of God will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. And then finally, brothers, whatever is true, brothers and sisters, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things. Think about such things. And when we talk about this idea, first thing I hope it stands out to you is this idea of think. There's a strong admonition here to think. Be mindful of your thought processes, because our thinking, and we'll look here at some great verses, and then I want to kind of overlap and do some blending here. But when it says in this verse, be anxious for nothing, Don't be anxious about anything. Be anxious for nothing, whatever version you have there. Paul's referring to an ongoing state. He's not referring, like, we can read that. I remember when I first understood this idea that when you read that, it's almost like, get rid of, you shouldn't have any anxiety. It's referring to an idea of an ongoing, lingering state. It doesn't mean that we're not going to have these pop-ups in our life, these things that we need some course correction. And so when we look at that, it's like, don't let your life be perpetually anxious is really what this verse is about. And so as we look at this, that's what I want this message to be about, is how to be monitoring, how to understand and clear up your own filtering system and understanding what goes on in triggering anxiety. So there's some great verses to help us understand from a biblical perspective, and I could have a sheet of these of about 25 of them, but I'm just going to read about 3 of them, or 4 of them, I guess. Proverbs 23:7, where it talks about, as a man thinks in his heart, so is he. As a man thinks in his heart, so is he. Proverbs 4:23, you know that one. Above all else, guard your heart. Guard your heart. Be mindful of what you're letting in, for it's the wellspring of life. Meaning, be careful what you put in there. It's like a geyser. It's the wellspring of life. 2 Corinthians 10:5, where Paul is speaking about that we bring every thought captive before the obedience of Christ. Bring every thought captive. So just understand, there's a Bible study on each one of these, right? But the importance of understanding of our thought life. What's going on in the way that we think? What are we doing with our thought life? And then a great key verse in all of the New Testament surrounding this is Romans 12:2. Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. This idea of being transformed. If I had a whiteboard here, I could draw this little picture, that when we're according to like 2 Thessalonians chapter 5, I think it's 5:23. It's right there at the very end. Wasn't planning on talking about this, but that we're a spirit. It's where Paul says, bless your spirit, soul, and body. And our spirit is what comes alive at the moment of a relationship with Jesus. Our soul is our mind, our will, and our emotion, and our body. Our spirit's what's made perfect at salvation. Our soul is what this whole idea of being transformed by the renewing of your mind, this is our soul, our mind, our will, and our emotion. And then we have our body. Now, there's interplay with all of these things, right? What I'm doing to nurture my spirit, these are, in some ways, are helpful to look at as kind of silos, but in other ways to look at them as kind of overlapping, almost Venn diagram kind of thing, if you will. But to be aware that our spirit man is made perfect at salvation. Our body is what we can do with it by, we'll talk about that as even related to anxiety. But our soul, our mind, think about like a pie, 3 pieces of that pie: mind, will, and emotion. And that's what we're in the business of bringing, that's being transformed. And we have a responsibility, a role in that. So when we look at these things, we look at these verses, that, above all else, guard your heart. Like we have a responsibility to guard what goes in there. Trash in, trash out. And so we're always in the business here we're in a business of soul transformation is really what the whole development, what we call, big 50-cent word in Christian language, of sanctification. Sanctification is that your soul is being transformed by the renewing of your mind. So as we go through here, we want to understand what goes on and what is kind of this filtering system that is running the show in our lives. I want to tell you a brief story. Being on this side of town, everybody can relate to this. So I have 4 children. My oldest is 28, Catherine, and she's probably at this point 18 months, maybe 2 years old, in a car seat. I'm driving, I think, like a little Toyota, and I'm up at Gessner. This is when we lived in Spring Shadows, way back. And so we are coming off, I can't remember where we were, coming off the freeway, exit only at Gessner. And as we're exiting, I look up in my rearview mirror, and there's like this giant, like F-250, 350, and I mean, he is right on me, on my bumper. I mean, I quickly do the math. I'm thinking the edge of his bumper through my little trunk to the back of her head is about 30 inches or something. You know, I'm thinking, I wish I had a bazooka right now, you know. Like, I just want to, like in the movies, you know, just, hi, sweetheart. And in a Christian kind of way. You know, I mean, immediately, this idea, you know, I'm just enraged. Now, the idea here, thinking about how, so I want to take just a little moment, a little pause here, that to remember that all of our emotion is preceded by what goes on in our thought life. Every emotion that you have, whether you realize it or not, every situation that we went, you know, there it is. Tim, why'd you want to shoot the guy with a bazooka? Well, because he was right at the back of my daughter's head. The reality is, whether we know it or not, that emotion is quickly filtered through a cognition, a thought. That's all cognition is. Cognitive psychology is just you can go up to UT or I think A&M too and get a PhD in cognitive psychology. And it's all, at the end of the day, it boils down to having to determine how we think, what we're thinking about. And so that moment, you know, that this happens, it runs through this. And, you know, what is my filtering system? Now, I'm elaborating, but, you know, all of this, like most of our things that take place, it's like 1.5 seconds, right? And that quick filter was, you know, this guy, it's kind of like a good old boy, whoever has the biggest truck rules the roost, and I don't care who it is or what I run over, and that's my immediate filtering system. And this is what he's going to do, and he doesn't care about me or my daughter or anybody else on the road. And so he's ready to run us off. So we exit. No, actually, he immediately kind of guns it. It's diesel, because I can see him go around me, and the smoke's coming out. I'm just like, you jerk. Okay, and so we exit the Owen-Gessner, and I fade over to my right lane because I'm going down towards Spring Shadows, and he's going straight and zooms and gets up to the light. And I'm sitting there and kind of toying with her toes and playing with her, and, you know, but I'm looking up there at him, and he gets to the light, of course, and sorry, I take a decongestant in the morning, it always drives me out. But, and I'm watching, and I'm looking up there, and I'm looking through the back windshield. And I'm like, you know, man, you were in such a hurry or whatever. And then when I see him get up there, and then I look in the back seat, because it's like a dual cab, and I see two people facing one another. And immediately, I'm like, what are they doing? And I look, and I see somebody kind of going down like this, and then the key was I see this. And I see, and I immediately, my interpretation about all of this has just changed, right? My interpretation is, this is not some jerk who wants to run the road. This is a guy, I mean, who's in the back seat of this truck? There's two people doing CPR in the back seat of this truck, and they're about to make a left turn, and they're heading to Memorial City to go into the ER, I'm sure. And so immediately, what happens once my belief system changes? The moment my filtering, sometimes I call it our B-tip, our beliefs, our thoughts, our interpretation, our perception, my own little made-up acronym. But my B-tip changes. My interpretation of what just happened changed. Do I have to think about, I need to change my emotion? It changes on its own. The question is, what am I doing with my thoughts, my interpretation? Once the interpretation changed, and this guy is no longer a jerk, but this is a guy that's like, and what flows out of our emotion, right? I mean, the cognition, the thought changes. The next thing that changes is the emotion, right? All of a sudden, I move from hatred to this guy to compassion. I'm thinking, if I could get up there, like he gets to the light and stops, I'm like, run the stinking light. Somebody's dying in your back seat. And so immediately what happens after, so we have the thoughts, the emotion changes, my behavior changes, my relationship with the guy that he doesn't know he has a relationship with me, it all changes. But it all starts back here with what's going on. As a man thinks in his heart, so is he. Above all else, guard your heart, for it's wellspring of life. Be transformed by the renewing of your mind. So the importance of understanding what's going on in our mind, what's going on in that giant filtering system that God gives us responsibility for. So therein lies a lot around biblical discipleship and a lot around cognitive psychology. So lots of overlay, lots of interplay there. But most of us don't either understand the importance of this, and we don't really, it takes work to actually stop and take a look at this thing, this belief system, these thoughts, because it's really easy to blame things on our circumstances. We can run things through our circumstances. You know, why you ticked off? Well, the guy's running me off the road. But I don't want to minimize what circumstances we deal with, but how we interpret these things through our own life grid is our responsibility. And it doesn't mean, you know, sometimes it really is a jerk that wants to run people off the road. It really is a terrible boss. It really is a really terrible life circumstance in our family. And we do have real, genuine, accurate feelings of sadness and other things that follow. So I'm not minimizing that this can happen, but we just need to be accurate with what goes on here and to be aware that this really does lead all of this out. And that what we deal with in terms of anxiety, this is what we have to work with. If you come into dealing with in therapy about this is what we're looking for. This is what I'm looking for. So, one of those principles about it is that anxiety underlies a lot of things that people deal with. That's one of the things I've learned over the many decades of doing this. People will come in for things around addiction relapse. They'll come in dealing with issues around essentially the way that I see it is how much people will come in dealing with, say, marital struggles, and how oftentimes people's own anxiety is what triggers a lot of this. And their anxiety at times is just people are unaware of it. That's another principle around here. People are unaware of how much anxiety. Another principle around this is how many medical conditions that it costs, the U.S. billions of dollars every year. If you do any research on this, you'll see that how much GPs, internal medicine docs, deal with things that are really anxiety related. They will tell you this. Why medications around for anxiety are like the top selling drugs around statins and everything else. But anxiety medications are such huge sellers because essentially people don't have an understanding of what it takes. We want shortcuts around it. I'm not anti-medication, but I'm very, very conservative on what I think is appropriate in regard to medication, because anxiety is really very much like the light on your dashboard. It's just telling you when that light comes on, you don't look at it and say, well, that's a dumb light. Give me a piece of duct tape. No. You look and you say, let me interpret. What's the light say? It says check engine. Gives you a little code sometimes. You go under, you look at the manual. It tells you, take a look at this in the engine. But the light, the indicator light, your anxiety, is often just an indicator of you need to take a look at the engine. And the engine is what's going on in your thought life. Let me just say also, anxiety is not an enemy. Anxiety is not our enemy. Anxiety is God's warning system. It is like the light on the dashboard. God gives us this to tell us there's danger and what we need to do with it. But what we do with this is what is so hugely imperative here. The idea that anxiety is coming up for us, we look at it, and many times we want to either ignore it, we will medicate it, and we have all kinds of cool euphemisms for this, right? I just needed a couple stiff drinks to take the edge off. I needed to do, I can tell you, everybody I deal with that deals with some type of addiction, there's always anxiety that's surrounding it. Whether it's alcohol, some kind of drugs, even legal drugs, our docs will give us lots of, I see a lot of Adderall that's prescribed for people dealing with anxiety. Because it's amazing what amphetamines will do to help you feel like, wow, I'm on top of my game. I don't feel anxious about anything. Besides all the regular anti-anxiety drugs that can be prescribed, but how many other even legal prescription drugs, but alcohol, pornography, hugely intertwined. Speak with people all the time, well, really what happened with the relapse? How did this happen? And we start backing it up, and it's always about some issue of anxiety and not knowing how to manage it. What else would I want to say? I just went through and wrote out some bullet points for myself to just make sure we talk about them. Another way that people will try to deal with their anxiety is by avoidance. People try to avoid the things that bring anxiety. And anxiety is a funny thing like this. When we try to avoid, I see people that will avoid whether it's everything from I just don't like to drive on highways, or I don't like tall buildings, or I don't like whatever can promote or provoke anxiety, and people will try to avoid. And what happens is our brain does this tricky little thing. We practice avoidance, so there's a trigger of some sort, and we find a way to avoid it. Maybe it's, I just don't like a lot of people, so I avoid walking down the hallway, I go around, or, and we find all these little sort of workarounds to not have to walk through the anxiety. And so, but our brain learns, that worked. And whenever, there's a little saying, it says, whenever we relieve pain quickly, we create an addiction. And whenever we relieve pain quickly. So, that's one of those kind of proverbial things, a lot of truism in it. But we can practice avoidance, and so we avoid that scenario, and what our brain learns right there is, oh, that's how we fix this. But two things that happen. One is our world gets smaller. Whenever we try to avoid to fix our anxiety, our world always gets smaller. We shrink what we're willing to do, and we'll pull it in a little bit more. And our brain learns, don't go there because you can't handle it. And the necessity at the end of the day of stepping into the very thing that we're uncomfortable dealing with. So some of you, need to have a hard conversation with your wife, but you're avoiding it. You're anxious about it. You need to have a conversation, whether it's about your money, relationship, feeling doldrum in the marriage, sex life, whatever, and you're avoid. And what your brain has learned is, can't handle that, avoid that, and your world got smaller. Your marriage got smaller. Every time you obeyed that, your world just got a little bit smaller. And the brain will continue to teach you, and it'll just continue to take over more and more. So whether it's relational anxiety, whether it's something, as I mentioned, about I've seen people afraid of elevators or escalators or highways, people that are afraid of getting up here in front of folks and speaking. Public speaking is the number one fear for people. But all of these things that we want to believe that if I just avoid that it's going to make it go away. And it just doesn't. And all it does is it grows and it shrinks your world every time. Another thing, let's see. Well, when I talk about that, I wrote myself a little note here just to remind me that, that to remember Anxiety itself is, like I said, light on dashboard. It's like a radar detector. Three principles around this piece I'm talking about. I just call it normalization, exposure, habituation. That is, accept that anxiety is natural, but can become unhealthy. So when you get anxious about something, you have to accept, like, oh yeah, there's some normalcy to it. If you put yourself in a category of shame, like, what's wrong with me? I can't do this or whatever, then you can't do anything with it. Normalization, exposure, which is just understand your fears and begin facing them, and a habituation, that is just start growing in it. Like if it's about having a conversation with your wife, normalization, wow, all of us as men, we can be petrified of having that hard conversation with our wife. Exposure, we step into it. We start having that conversation. We start talking. We start engaging. And then we start learning like, okay, habituation is, what are the skills I need? Well, one is how I bring it up. What is it about my tone of voice? Do I come across as angry? Do I come across as I'm really interested in wanting to increase, the relationship? And, you start learning some skills about what to do there. But this can apply all across the board to things that people are dealing with. Seeing people in the workplace, how much, people are super anxious there, dealing with life stuff, all the stuff with kiddos running around. But we have to learn how to both expose ourselves to it and then start growing in our knowledge. Like to think, I'm just going to avoid, as I've already mentioned, I won't beat that dead horse, but then start growing our willingness to step into it a little bit more. And it actually works. Your brain, it's there built and it's learning how to detect danger. And once it starts learning, this isn't really dangerous. This is not, I don't have to be afraid of this. Once it starts learning this, you become more and more willing to step into this. And see that, a distinction here, we use words like stress, anxiety, fear, and to remember, fear actually sees a threat, whereas anxiety imagines a threat. Fear, we actually see some kind of threat. But anxiety, we imagine a threat. We imagine it, and our brain is such that when we imagine a threat, it feels like it's really a threat. It feels like it's just as real, and that we really are in a place of being threatened. And that we'll live it out as if it's very real. And so we'll avoid, and thus it becomes like, I just don't do that sort of thing. And again, our world just shrunk and it gets smaller. Another point here I just want to bring up here is many times we're unaware that when we're dealing, that I talked a little bit about this, but I want to hone in on this a little bit. We're unaware that we're dealing with anxiety. We may be dealing with anger, frustration. I remember when we started having kiddos, before children, I'm your typical kind of type A guy, and I was young, so, I might get up in the morning and go do a run, come home while I'm still sweaty, mow the grass. I'm really dirty. I'll change the oil in my car. I'd have this list of stuff, and each child is like the list, until the fourth, and just don't even make a list anymore. Hire people to do it. But I remember somewhere in there that how I would become, my Saturdays, I found myself starting to brood around. And I would just be kind of like tense and I was just kind of frustrated with my Saturdays. And finally, I'm like, what is wrong with you? I realized finally I was still carrying the belief that I needed to be able to get all these things done. And I was anxious about it, but I didn't call it anxiety. It wasn't like compelling life overwhelm, but it was, it was kind of that low level, it's like a low-grade fever, operating with a low-grade fever. It's like when you have a 99.3 fever and you go to work anyway, you feel about 50%, but nobody else really knows it. And that's kind of the way a lot of us will operate. And I was operating with that. And I've realized after, I can't remember, it's been too long now, I just remember at some point thinking, why am I angry or this low-level frustration? And I realized, well, mostly it's because I'm just not getting anything done anymore. And I've had to come to grips with, well, what am I believing about this? I'm believing that at some level I should still be able to get all these things done, or at least some of them. I had to finally come to grips. You're not going to get any of this done. You have 4 soccer games on Saturday morning. You have, a wife you're trying to take care of, trying to, do baseline stuff. You got to give all of it up. And it was like there was a bit of both relief and sadness, like, dude, I'm a sort of a do-it-yourself kind of guy. I grew up in a blue-collar home. We do all these things ourselves. It was hard to sort of let all this stuff go. And I just realized either I can be an engaged dad and take care of life here with children, or I can do all this. And, it wasn't much of a vote. But once I came to grip with what was really happening, and once my belief about this all changed, the feeling changed. But my point there, why do I tell you that story? The story is just to say that we don't even realize at times that we're dealing with anxiety. That was an anxiety kind of experience for me, that it manifested as that low-grade kind of brooding frustration. And I just encourage you to stop and take a look at your life. Like, what kind of emotion do you have that's going on subtly under the surface? Could be some low-grade depression, irritability. And you wonder, what is really going on there? To stop and ask. One of the things that I find with us as men, we're not real good at doing is we're not very introspective. We don't just stop long enough to become introspective. That's why I think doing journaling is a good process, and to really understand. I have a good journal template. I should have brought it here today, actually. But something to help you get really more in touch with what's going on in your inner man. Most of us are just in like a zone of just cruising through life. We are just not practicing much of a life of introspection, and just stopping and asking, these questions, the what and why questions. If you take everything I'm saying so far, really, a lot of it could be boiled down to just, when I'm talking about like the emotion preceded by these thought processes, I say sometimes it's just called the what and the why. What am I feeling? Why am I feeling it? That's what I did when I told you about the whole thing with the frustration with Saturday mornings for me. It was, what am I feeling? Brooding, frustration, kind of irritable, children are kind of a nuisance, and don't ask me one more thing to do. It comes out as, and it can sound so like, I just got so much to do, and all of this, and it's like, but asking myself the why am I feeling this? And that's really what a good journal experience is about, is learning to dig down and to really understand and to bring to the surface what's in your heart. Because, again, as a man thinks in his heart, so is he, even if he's oblivious to it. We may be clueless like I was. So the what is here, and it's happening. People experience, how do people experience me? I mean, that's just a good question to ask. How do people experience me? How does my wife experience? How do my children experience me? But this idea of the why, the what and the why, and to ask ourselves, why is this happening? Why is this? And to move beyond just your circumstance, your situation. Just, well, my wife is, my my job, my boss is such a jerk, but dig down for your own self. One of the things that I would talk about in this is that another principle around this is that many times we bring our own junk to the playground. What I mean by that is, we grow up, all of us have grown up in imperfect homes, and we bring these family of origin patterns, these things, these voices that are still lingering in our head. doesn't matter how old we are, that we can still carry these memories, these feelings that are deeply ingrained. Little brain understanding here real quick. We have this left side of our brain, and to remember it, just remember left is like your linear side, your language, your logic side. Over here, everything you had to think this morning. Let's see, I got to leave at 6 to be there by 6:15, shower by, get done, whatever. And you're utilizing that side of your brain. But over here, this right side of our brain, and when I say left, right, some of that's a little old school. It's just the idea that this prefrontal cortex is really what it's called. The right brain is this limbic system, and it's the feeling side of the brain. It's the stuff that interprets what's going on. When you meet somebody, you're immediately interpreting these people around you. You're interpreting me right now the way you're like, is he really believable? Does he know what he's talking about? Do I really like him? That's your right side of the brain. You're immediately utilizing that. And these things are interplaying the whole time. You're thinking, is this guy going to get done? What time we need to leave, Brett? What time we close up here? Oh, darn, 7:15. Whoa, sorry. Okay, that went faster than I thought. Okay, but this right brain is this feeling side of our brain. And this, we like to say, this part of our brain doesn't know the difference between yesterday and 30 years ago, yesterday and 60 years ago. Like if you have old lingering tapes, mom tapes, dad tapes, negative tapes, bullying tapes, these things linger. And at times we're like, oh, what's wrong with me? I'm 60 years old and I'm still carrying this. The fact is that part of our brain, until we do something to get this resolved, we carry this. We can carry it to our grave. A lot of people do. They live it out all their life because that kind of traumatic brain stuff lingers over here. And we want to think, oh, I know better. I go to church. I know Jesus loves me. I practice biblical principle, And I really want to believe that my left brain is going to fix this right brain trauma, emotional side of our brain. It just doesn't. I wish it did. It just doesn't. And that's where I would say that when you carry those things, you ought to get some professional help. There's some really cool tools to help people do that. But it's just not something you can think yourself out of. And most of us as men want to think, I'm independent, I'm capable, I'm going to think myself out of it. You just won't. And you can carry this for the rest of your life. And, again, you kind of know it by what's my thought life like? How do people experience me? Am I difficult? Do I deal with self-medication things? And that's usually a sign that we're carrying this kind of junk over here. So, all right, let me jump forward here. Sorry about that. A couple more minutes. The last couple things I just want to say, anxiety grows in solitude. Anxiety grows in solitude. We need community. The stuff that Clint's doing with the fine groups. How many people are actually in fine groups? 250, 260 men. I mean, that's incredible. Like, Clint's one of my heroes on the west side of town. I mean, doing this kind of work because I so much believe in the power of community, to tell your story, to have opportunity to tell your story. And we say, tell your story as often as you can with safe people that are safe, but tell your story. Tell what makes you who you are. The more you do, you reduce shame, you reduce all the junk inside, all the internal messages. Tell your story as often as you can to the right people. And good small groups, fine groups, MDPC small groups, just super, super helpful. And the last thing I'll just tie together, I said this earlier. Well, in terms of the principles that lead to anxiety, talked about the soul and mind, will, emotion, talked about spirit and the physical body. Don't underestimate the power of taking care of your body. That we know when we say, I'm really stressed. Really another way of saying that is my cortisol is really heightened right now. And one of the ways that we know that our cortisol will drop is with cardiovascular exercise. So I just highly encourage you, keep your body moving, do stuff with it, no matter what age you are. If you want a great book on this, a book by John Rady called Spark, R-A-T-E-Y is his name, John Rady, and it's a great book. It's these standalone chapters on how exercise, it's not about your cardiovascular. He's like, read another book on that. Everything's been read. I want to talk about how exercise helps your brain and how it helps your brain for depression, anxiety, managing stress, your agedness, addiction, and he has these how it helps you to learn better. It's very powerful. Harvard guy. In spite of that, it's really a great book. All right, making sure you're paying attention. And the last thing I just want to talk about is a spiritual element too, is practicing vulnerability in your prayers. What you really feel like, just use the Psalms as your template. You know, those dudes, I mean, obviously, especially David, I mean, just down and dirty. I just so appreciate the level of vulnerability. Dan Allender wrote a book several years ago called Cry of the Soul. He and his buddy Tremper Longman. Amazing book, and it's just basically looking at the Psalms, the emotions, our emotions as reflected in the Psalms, clinical psychologist and his theologian. But they just talk about the level of vulnerability. I just found that to be an extremely helpful spiritual practice of practicing like, God, I am confused. God, I hate this. God, I need this. God, I'm disgusted with this. Use real emotional words in your prayer life. Don't gloss it over. Like, get out of high church with the Lord. When you hit your knees, be honest with the Lord. It reminds me of the full serenity prayer. Some of you are familiar with the serenity prayer, but the full serenity prayer. And that's just practicing vulnerability, simplicity in your prayers. And I love how the full serenity, this will be our closing remark. The serenity prayer, God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and wisdom to know the difference. That's most where everybody stops. But the rest of it, as Paul Harvey would say, the rest of the story, living one day at a time, enjoying one moment at a time, accepting hardships as the pathway to peace, taking as he did, Jesus, this sinful world as it is, not as I would have it, trusting that he will make all things right if I surrender to his will, so that I may be reasonably happy in this life and supremely happy with him forever and ever in the next. So if you'll pray with me, guys, we'll call it a day and we'll break in small groups for the last few minutes. Lord, thank you for the time, opportunity to be together. I humbly pray, Lord, on behalf of all of us, that what we're dealing with today, you're fully aware of it. You desire to step into the midst of our story. And I just ask that your Spirit will give clarity of thought and mind as we navigate these waters. And we just pray that you will just interject yourself in the midst of all of it to the degree that we practice just openness, transparency with you. So we commit our ways to you afresh this day, Lord, and ask that the Holy Spirit, not that we just walk with you, but that you, God, are directing and we're just in the flow of how you're moving this day. In the name of Jesus, we can pray these things. Amen. Thank you, gentlemen.